This is a beginner's HTML and CSS course that will help you improve your skills by building a real-world project. Madison Khanna is an experienced front-end engineer and excellent instructor.
Hey there, I'm Madison, and today we're going to be building this NFT preview card component. This course is for absolute beginners to HTML and CSS. If you have no previous experience with HTML or CSS, then this course is for you. This course is also for you if you have some experience with HTML and CSS, but you want to cement your learning by building something. By the end of this course, you will have built an NFT preview card, and you can use this in your developer portfolio. I'm really excited to be building this with you, so let's get started. The first thing you're going to need is a free account on frontendmentor.io. I already created my account, so as soon as you've created yours, you should see this screen and you can hit Visit Challenge Hub. Here we can download our starter files, so I'm going to hit Download Starter. Next we have step 2, which says Download Design File. I have the Pro membership, but we are using the free membership today, so we don't have access to our Sketch or Figma. I want to explain what this means for a second. When you're working as a developer, you're often going to be given designs from a designer at your company, and these will essentially be pictures of how your application you are building is supposed to look. Figma and Sketch are these commonly used tools that you can use to see the designs of the application. As a quick example, let's look at this UI with Figma tutorial, and if we scroll down, we can see what Figma looks like. Say your designer gives you this design and they say, this is what this part of the app should look like. You as the developer can come into Figma here and you can click on things such as this new arrival text. And from here, you'll be able to get what the exact font size is, and you can see the exact font color used. And you can go and take this font color and put it in your application where it's needed. Now back to our NFT preview card. We are not going to be using the design files today because we are using the free membership, but that's okay because we are going to kind of eyeball it and we're going to look at the picture of the card and reference the picture when building our NFT preview card. I just wanted to point out what Sketch and Figma were real quick because when I started out learning how to code, I didn't know about tools like Figma and Sketch, and I always wondered how exactly a developer turns a design into code. Let's get to building. So we've already hit download starter files, so let's open these starter files in our text editor. First, we are going to go and open our text editor, and then we're going to hit Command O. Inside of here, we can go to my downloads and click this recent download with the starter files and open it up. And I'm going to hit later on this because I never really do my upgrades. Let's look at our starter files. Now, if you're not familiar with a text editor yet, your text editor is just where you'll write your code. I use VS Code, but you can use any text editor that you like. Now, let's briefly go over what's in these starter files. First, we have this design folder. And this is going to show us pictures of how our card should look. And again, if you work as a developer, you will usually be given designs by your designer in a tool like Figma or Sketch. But for today, we'll be looking at these pictures to reference as we build our NFT card. We see that we also have what our card looks like when it's in an active state or a hover state, so when your mouse hovers over the card. We also have mobile and desktop designs, and they tell us what the card should look like when you're on a phone versus when you're on your computer. For our purposes today, we're just going to focus on building the desktop view. Next, we have our style guide, and this is going to tell us the exact colors that we need as well as the font size we need and so on. Next, in this index.html file, we have a basic HTML setup as well as the information we need to build our card. And we could start coding within this file, but we are actually going to create a new folder to build our NFT card. We're going to create a new folder to build our card because I want us to build our NFT card completely from scratch. Let's leave these starter files here and we'll reference them later. Next, we're going to open up our terminal and start building our NFT card from scratch. So we'll go down here and we'll hit open on our terminal, and then I'm going to make this a little bit bigger so we can see it more clearly. We'll use the command mkdir, and this will create a new folder for us, and we'll name this folder or repository NFT card. This just creates a new repository with this name. A repository is just a place where all the code for your NFT card will be stored. So let's hit enter on there. And the next thing that we want to do is open up our NFT card folder inside of our text editor. We can do this by saying code NFT card, and then we'll hit enter. Now we can see that our NFT card folder has been opened up inside of our text editor. Perfect. Now, if you ran this command code NFT card and it didn't work, you can also just go into your text editor and you can hit open, and you can open up your NFT card folder from here. The first thing I'm going to do is create my index.html file. So here I'll write index.html. What we've done here is we've created our very first HTML file. You might be wondering, why did we name this index.html? So index is a special name that we can use that will tell our browser that this is the home page of our app. The index.html is the default page on a website if no other page is specified. And this index.html file is a file we can actually view in our web browser. Now let's expand this a little bit. And next we're going to write !enter. We've just created some boilerplate code using Emmet, which is a tool that's built right into VS Code. If you are using a different text editor, you can just look at the finished code for this project and grab that HTML boilerplate. Here is just some starter HTML that we need that does different things for us, that gets us set up. So for example, this title is the title of our site, so we can rename this to NFT card. We'll dive more into HTML basics in a moment, but first off, let's write out an H1 tag and we'll say hello world. And then let's go view this file in our browser. So here we've gone back to our browser, and I'm using Chrome, and I'm going to hit Command O. And here we're going to go find our NFT card. So we'll search for NFT card, and then we're going to open up index.html. So we'll hit open. And here we can see our file and the text that we wrote, hello world. Now this app is just local to our computer, right? We don't have a URL that we can send to someone so they can go and see our app. If we wanted to, we could deploy this NFT card to the internet, which just means we could go buy a domain like nftcards.com, and we could deploy our app so that anyone who visited nftcards.com, they would be able to go and see this hello world. But for now, we're just going to be building our application locally. Next up, let's go over some HTML basics. HTML is short for Hypertext Markup Language, although I'm not sure if anyone ever remembers what HTML stands for. HTML is the code that is used to structure a web page and its content. HTML consists of a series of elements, which you use to wrap different parts of the content on your web page. Let's go over some HTML syntax. First, we have the opening tag here. This opening tag states where the element begins or starts to take effect. Next, we have the closing tag. This is the same as the opening tag, except that it includes a / before the element name. This tells us where the element ends. In this case, it tells us where our H1 element ends. Then we have the content. In this case, the hello world text is our content. And this whole thing with the content and the opening tag as well as the closing tag, this is all the element itself. Here we can say this is one HTML element. We'll dive deeper into HTML as the course goes on, but let's go on to the second thing that we'll be learning in this course, which is CSS. Let's create the file where our CSS will live. So we'll right click and we'll click New File, and then we'll write styles.css. Let's talk more about CSS basics. CSS stands for Cascading Style Sheets, and CSS is a styling language that modifies the appearance of the content of websites. Let's go over CSS syntax. First part of CSS syntax is the selector that you see here. A CSS selector is the first part of a CSS rule. This tells the browser which HTML element should be selected to have the CSS property values inside this rule. Next, we have these curly brackets, which are used to signify the start and the end of the styles that will be applied to this selector. Everything in between these curly brackets are styles that are applied to the HTML elements that match this selector. Now, inside of these brackets are these property value pairs that you see here. Each property has a value. Let's go over an example. Here the selector is this H1 element. And here we are saying select all H1 elements and make them have a background color of blue. The background color is the property and the value is blue. Now let's go see this in action in our application. Let's use a link tag because we need a way of connecting our CSS to our HTML. So right over here under title, we're going to write out link, and then we'll say rel Stylesheet, and then we'll say href styles.css, and then we'll end this here. Now we can test that our CSS is going to get applied to our HTML. Let's go over to our styles.css, and the selector we'll use, just as in our example, will be H1, and we're going to say background color purple. Let's save this and then go back to the browser. Here in our browser, if we refresh, we can see that our H1 with the content of Hello World now has a purple background. Awesome. As a front-end developer, you'll be using HTML and CSS to style the content of your website. You would also use JavaScript alongside HTML and CSS. We won't be using JS in this course, but it's helpful to understand a little bit. When you're building the front end of an application, you can think of a house analogy. The HTML is the building blocks, the CSS is the style of the house, and lastly, JavaScript is the interactivity. It is the moving pieces. As an example, the HTML could be thought of as the walls of the house or the bricks that make up the house. The HTML is all of the building blocks of your house. And the CSS might be the color of the walls or the style of the couch. And JavaScript will be the parts of your house where things happen. So with JavaScript, it might be turning on the lights or starting the dishwasher. And on a website, JavaScript is all of those interactive parts, such as seeing an animation or whatever happens when you click on a button. Let's look at a real-world example of how HTML and CSS are used. Since we are building an NFT card, we're at OpenSea.io, and if we right-click and hit inspect, we can actually see the divs on this page. And over here, we can also see the CSS that's being used. Cool, so let's get back to building our application. Now, as we said earlier, what we're doing here is we're saying we want to select all the H1 tags on this page and give them all a background color of purple. And we can see this in action if we create another H1 and we'll say hello again. And then if we go back to our browser and we refresh, we see that the second H1 tag also has the background color of purple. But what if we don't want this second H1 to also have a background color of purple? The problem is we wrote this CSS rule and it says we want all H1s to have a background color of purple. So every single H1 on this page is going to have the background of purple. And maybe we don't want that. Let's use another CSS selector to fix this. We want to say, okay, I only want this very first element in particular to have a purple background, but I don't want the other ones to. We need to somehow differentiate this element from the other element. We're going to use a CSS selector called a class selector. So here we'll say class, and then we're going to give this a class name, and we'll say purple element. And we're going to save that. And then we'll go back to our CSS and we'll use this class selector here. So we'll say purple element and we'll save it. And now we can see that this second div no longer has the purple background. It no longer has the purple background because now we are saying that we only want elements with the class of purple element to get this background color. Now that we understand more of the syntax of CSS, let's get to actually building our NFT preview card. Back in our application, I'm just going to adjust this so we have a little bit more room here. Let's get rid of both of these and we're going to create a div. A div defines a section in an HTML document. We're going to give this div a class called card. This div is going to be the container for our NFT card. And for now, we'll just write card inside of this and hit save. The next thing we're going to do is come back to our CSS and remove this. And we're going to use the card class selector here. And we're going to give our card a width. So we're going to say width 450. Next, we need to give this div a background color. So let's go into our starter files and look for the color we need. Over here, we're back in our starter files. And we're going to go into the style guide. Now here we're going to grab all of the colors that we need and we're going to copy them. Back over in our project, we are going to push this down a little bit and we're just going to copy these in. So you might have seen a hex code in other CSS examples, and these are just different ways of representing a certain color. So we are actually going to write root and then this curly bracket, and then the ending curly bracket for that rule will be down here. If you're wondering why we would write root right here, this root is essentially a place where we can declare global CSS variables. So variables we can use within all of our CSS. Now let's turn all of these certain colors that we have into CSS variables. We won't need all of these colors just yet, but they'll definitely be handy to have throughout the course. So to create a CSS variable, we are going to write another dash. We're going to lowercase this and create the name, which is soft blue. And then we're also going to add the semicolon at the end. We're going to do this for every color here. Great, now we have all of our CSS variables. So here we can say we want a background color of var card background, or card BG for short. And this way we don't have to take this HSL up here and put it down here every single time. The next thing we'll do is give our card a color of soft blue. So we'll say var soft blue. And this is the text color that we want. CSS variables are great to use because we could reuse this soft blue variable elsewhere in our application, and we know this soft blue will be the exact color we want for our text. Now, a CSS variable can sound like a scary word, but really it is just a name for this color. So the variable name for this variable is soft blue, and its value is this color up here. Now, if we go back to our browser and refresh, we see we have this card with the right colors. The next thing that I've done is I've gone into split screen mode. So on the left here, I can see my app or my card open in the browser, and on the right, I can see my code. This will just help me work a little bit quicker. Now let's look at something interesting here. Let's add a div inside of this card div, and we'll say, I love coding. And we'll save this, and we'll refresh. And we'll see that even though this div does not have the class of card, it still has this text color of soft blue. And this is because This div is inside of the card div. You can think of this card as being the parent div, and this inside of it is the baby. It's kind of similar to how I have blue eyes and I inherited my blue eyes from my parents who both have blue eyes. This is a fundamental piece of CSS, which is that CSS cascades. That is, children divs will inherit styles from their parent divs. A question you might have is, what if as the child div over here, what if I don't want to have a text color of soft blue? What if I want to have a text color of bright red? And so if I want to do this, I can add a class to this child div. So I'll say class red, and then I can go back to the code and I'll say .red color red. And if we refresh, we can see that this child div now has the text color of red. And let's just say command plus here so we can make this a little bit bigger. Now you might be wondering, well, we have this one color here that says make the text color blue. And then we have this other property over here of color and it says to make the text color of red. So what CSS rule wins here? And CSS answers this by saying the most specific rule wins. And in this case, the most specific rule is the child div with the color of red. And this is called CSS Specificity. And I can never say that right. So let's move on and work on our NFT title next. Let's just remove this. We're not going to need it. So let's get rid of this. Let's go back to our starter files and let's go grab the title of this card. So I'm going to copy this. Back inside of our app, we're going to create an h2 tag and we're going to paste in our title. And if we refresh, we can see it here. Let's add styles to this equilibrium title. First, we'll write out .card h2. And we'll give this a little space. Now we're going to select by the h2, but also by the card class, because if we remember from earlier, if we just write h2, then we're going to select for all h2 tags on the page, and we don't necessarily want to do that. Next, we're going to add a few things that this needs. We're going to add the font weight, the color, and the font size. We'll give this a font weight of 600. The text color inside of the card is going to be white, so we'll say color var white. This is the white CSS variable that we used earlier. Next, we'll get a font size of 22 pixels, and then we'll have a line height of 28. Now, if any of these CSS properties don't make sense to you, I encourage you to just pause this and go Google them real quick so you know exactly what we're doing here. Now, if we refresh, we see that our title is looking much more similar to the design. We're also going to go back and remove this card word. We don't need it anymore. We also want to add a bit of margin so that our title has space between it and the image that's on top of it. We'll talk more on margin later, but margin adds extra space around an element. So let's add some margin. And again, I will go over this shortly. If we go back to our design, we can see that in our regular state, our title has this white color right here. But if we go to the active state, when a user hovers over it, then it has this really beautiful blue. So let's add this. For this, we can use the selector hover. We can say .card h2 and then hover. And this is essentially saying that whenever a user hovers their mouse over this h2 element, then all of the styles inside of this bracket will get applied then and only then. Here we can say color var cyan. Now let's save this, go back and refresh. So here our title is still white, but when we hover over it, it has this beautiful blue. Perfect. Next, let's actually add our NFT image. Let's go back to the starter file and we're going to find our image here, and we're actually just going to Command C or copy it. Next, inside of our files, we're going to create a folder called images, and then we're just going to paste our image equilibrium image inside of that folder. Let's go back to our index.html and let's add our image. So this image will go right above our title. We're going to use an image tag. This is an element specifically made for images, and we're going to say image src, and then here we're going to actually add what image we want to use. There's a nice autocomplete that VS Code does here, and it's going to say images, and then we're going to look for the image we need. And then we are going to write out this closing tag here, and we're going to hit save. And then if we refresh, we can see we have this image. The problem is this image is way too big and our card is looking very ugly all of a sudden. To fix this, let's give our image element a class. So we'll call it NFT card. We'll save that. And then we'll go back over to our styles CSS. And here we're going to go and write NFT card. So we're using this class and we're going to add styles to this. And we're going to say width 100%. And width 100% means that we want to make this image element have the width of its parent element. Now, if we remember over here, this image element has the parent of the card. Now, if we remember, this image element is a child of this card div here, and we can tell that it's a child because it lives inside of this card div. So the card div starts here and it closes here, and then nested inside of this card div is the image element and the H2 element. When we say width 100%, we are essentially saying that we want this image to be the width of its parent. We gave this card div a width of 450. If we refresh, we can see that this image now has the width of 450. One thing that we'll notice here is that this card is not right up against the edge of the screen. There is a little bit of white space on the left there. And this is because our body tag is getting some default margin. Margin creates space around the element. We mentioned margin earlier and we're talking about it now, so let's dive into what margin is. To talk about margin, we're going to talk about one of the most important concepts in CSS, which is the CSS Box Model. In CSS, you can think of everything as a box. Every time you go on a website and you see a footer or a menu bar, you can imagine that everything has a box around it. If you understand how these boxes work, you'll be able to write really good CSS and create the websites that you want. Let's talk more about these boxes. Every box consists of 4 parts. First of all, we have the content. The content of the box. It's where text and images appear. Then you have the padding. Now, padding creates space inside of an element. Next, you have border. A border goes around the padding and content. And lastly, you have the margin, which we've previously talked about. Margin creates extra space around an element. This is called the box model in CSS. For every single element on your page, you can think of it as a box with these 4 parts that you can modify. Next, I'm going to go back to our app, and to get a little bit more space on the screen, I have exited out of the split screen mode. Next, I'm going to index.html, and underneath this H2 element, I'm going to add a p tag or a paragraph tag, and I'm going to paste in this text. Now, if you see that when I wrote my p tag, I had some autocomplete there. You may or may not have that on your text editor, but it's a nice autocomplete, so when I write my H1 tag, it automatically creates the closing tag there. If this isn't automatically created for you, then you might just have to go manually write that. Now, we talked about how in CSS, everything is a box with these 4 parts: margin, padding, border, and content. Let's go over these 4. We'll be using all 4 throughout the course. Back over in our browser with our app so far, I'm going to right-click and hit Inspect. Now here we have our card div, and we can see this div represented with our dev tools. And let's go over padding first. Now, if we first said padding top and we said 50 pixels, we can see that suddenly our card has this padding top. In other words, it has more space right on top of it there. We could also say padding right, and then we could see that our element now has more padding on its right. Now we could write out padding right, padding top, left, bottom, or we could just write padding and then write 4 values into here. So if we said 10 pixels, 10 pixels, 10 pixels, 10 pixels, this would be padding top, padding right, padding bottom, and padding left. And so if I increase any of these, so push this one up, we can see that padding right expanded. If I push this one here, we can see that padding bottom expanded. And so again, you can say padding right, padding top, or things like that, or you can just write padding and remember that you can write 4 values within here. I can remember this by thinking this as a clock. So first you have the clock starting at the top at 12 and then moving onwards right, bottom, and then left. So it moves in the direction of a clock. Next, say you just wanted padding top of 100 pixels. Again, you could see that padding top, so pushing more space inside of the element on its top. Or you could say padding, and you could say 100 pixels and then 0, 0, 0, 0. Oh, that's too many zeros. There we go. So these both accomplish the same thing. It's basically 2 different ways of writing the same thing. This is also true for margin as well. Next, let's talk about margin. So let's refresh and remove this style here. Now, margin is used to create extra space around the outside of the element. That's the difference between margin and padding. Padding creates space within the element, and margin creates space outside of the element. So if we go over here and we select our P tag, we can say a margin top of 500, just give it quite a lot. And we can see that this P tag has now been pushed away from the other element. So it's created quite a lot of space between this P tag element and our title tag element. We also have content, which we talked about as another part of the CSS Box Model. So here we have our P tag and the content inside is simply these words. Next, we have border. So we can write a border, and for shorthand, we can say 1 pixel solid red, and we can see there is now a border around our P tag. Border is kind of self-explanatory. It's when you want to have a certain border around your box, and then you can style it as you want. Now let's refresh again. We're not going to need that red border. Now that we know all of this about the CSS box model, we can go on to use these different things, padding, margin, and so on, understanding what they do exactly. Let's go back to our original problem where we have a little bit of extra white space right here. Now, if we go over here, we can see that we have a little bit of space. Now, if we go over here and we select our body tag, we can see that we have this margin of 8 pixels. And this is a default style that comes from the user agent style sheet. This just means default styles that we automatically get every time we create an index.html page and we add HTML to it. So let's go and remove this default margin. Back in our application, we're going to go to Styles. And then right below our root, we are going to use this star symbol and we're going to say margin 0 and padding 0. Now this star is the all selector, and this says go and select all elements. We don't want any margin or padding to start off with, and then we'll make sure to hit save. The next thing we'll do is add box sizing, border box. Now we are adding this border box thing to every single element on our page, which seems like a pretty big deal, right? So let's talk about what on earth this is. Box sizing is another pretty foundational concept in CSS. But what is it doing and why do we even care about it? Border box tells the browser to account for any border and padding in the values you specify for an element's width and height. This might sound really confusing, and this did confuse me for quite a while. So let's dive into this concept a little bit more. Now, first, let's just comment this out. When we comment this out, we're going to go see the problem, and then we'll add this back later to see how border box solves our problem. Here we're back in our browser with our NFT card open, And we are using our dev tools to look at our div with the class of card. If you remember, we gave this card a width of 450 pixels. So we just said, hey, we want this card to have a width of 450. Now, what if we want to add some padding right on the card? So we'll say padding right, and we'll say 50 pixels. And there you can see that this card now has this padding of 50 pixels just on its right. Now let's go and inspect the card again. Now, if we go and look over here, we can suddenly see that the card has a width of 500. And this is because we have added our padding, 50 pixels. The browser goes, okay, we have a width of 450 pixels, plus we have this inner padding of 50 pixels. And so now our card is in total a width of 500 pixels. But here is the problem. We set this card to have a width of 450 pixels, but it's not actually 450 pixels anymore. Its width has expanded to 500 pixels because of that added padding. And this is very confusing because as a developer, when you give a certain div a width of 450 pixels, you actually expect that div to have that width, right? But because we added padding, we no longer have that 450 width, we have expanded our card. The solution that developers use here is to add box sizing border box. And this is going to tell the browser that, hey, when you determine the height or the width of this div, simply account for the padding. Now let's go back into our card and let's add box sizing border box. And now when we hover over this card, we can see that it is 450 pixels wide. We still have that padding right of 50 pixels, and we still have that width of 450 pixels. So with box sizing border box added, now when we set this width of 450 pixels, we know that we can add padding or margin or border, and our element will stay the same width, and it'll just account for all of these properties being added. Most front-end developers will add box sizing border box to all of their elements by default at the start of a project because it's just more intuitive. And if you don't use border box, then you'll have this problem where you'll set widths on your elements and then they'll be bigger than you expected them to be later on. So let's go back, and inside of here, we will uncomment this back. So we're now using border box. Let's go back and look at the design of the card again. So we'll go into here. Now, if we see here, there is some padding around this card. There's padding on the top, on the bottom, and on the left and the right. So let's go and add this padding. Back in our styles, we'll go back to card and we'll say padding 25 pixels by 25 pixels. And when there is just two values here, this is going to be top and bottom, left and right. So let's save this and go back to our browser. Now here, if we refresh, we can see we have a good amount of padding here. If we go back to the design, we can also see that our card div has borders that look rounded, whereas over here, this looks quite square. So let's add a border radius. We'll say border radius 2%. We can also add a font weight of 300 and a line height of 26 pixels. Now, if we go back and refresh, we can see that our card now has this nice rounded border. Next, let's go back to our starter files and we want to grab this URL. And the next thing we'll do is we'll click import here and we're going to grab this link here. So we'll hit Command Copy. We're going to add this import to the top of our file like this. And next we'll hit View Word Wrap. That just makes things a little bit more organized. Next, we're going to use the body tag as our selector, and we're going to add that font family. So all of the text in our card will get this font family. Next, we'll also give this a font size, and I'm just getting this over from the starter files. If we go back to the starter files, it's telling us what font size we need here. And then I'm also going to give a background color of main BG. So we'll say var main BG. And we want this background color because if we go back to our starter files, we can see that our body tag or our general background has this dark blue. Let's go back to our card and refresh. And we can see this is looking much better. We have the font that we want, we have the background color, and so on. Next, we can see that we have the price of the NFT and we have the time left. So let's go ahead and add the images for these, and then we'll write out the HTML. So we need the clock, and I'm going to copy this. I'm going to go back over to my app. I'm going to go inside of images and hit Command V, which will paste this in. I'm going to go back and do the same for this icon. And again, going to paste this in. Great. And I'm going to close both of these now. Okay, so now I'm going to close this back and let's get started with writing this. So first I'm going to create a div that's going to be the container. If we go back and we look here again, we have on the left over here, we have this icon with the price, and then on the right we have this time icon and it says 3 days left. Now these are kind of next to each other. So we're going to create a container div where all of these children div and images will live inside. That's this div right here. We'll give it a class container. Now I'm going to add a little bit more space, and first I'm going to write out the price div. So we'll create a new div. I'm going to say the class is going to be price. And then inside that div, first I'm going to have the image. And we want this to be this one. We're also going to write an alt. So we didn't do this earlier, but an alt basically provides words in case you can't see this image here. So we're going to say ETH icon. And then we'll do the same up here. We'll say alt NFT image. Oh, and we can see that I've made a typo here. I accidentally have a div, but this just needs to be the image closing tag, which is just this. Perfect. Next, we have a div that's going to say 0.41 ETH. And we can see that if we go back and look at our starter files. Over here, this. Next, we're going to work on this time icon and adding this 3 days left. So again, we can create a container div, and inside of this div will live the time icon and then also the amount of time left. So again, we can say a class here, and we'll give this a class of time. And then inside of here, we're going to add the image, and the image was a clock icon. So we'll go into images, we have this nice autocomplete, and we'll say icon clock, and then we'll say an alt clock icon, and then we will close this image tag. And next up, we're going to write a div that says 3 days left. Great, so let's save this and take a look at it. Awesome, so we can see here we have both the icons we need and both of the content we need. Now, if we open up our inspector again, we can see that the first thing we want to do is get these two divs, the price div and the time div, next to each other. Back in DevTools, we see that we have our price div and our time div, and they are both children inside of this container div. We know that we need to get these two divs living side by side, and right now the price div is stacked on top of the time div. What we can do is add display flex to their parent container div. So let's add display flex. Now we can see that our two children divs are side by side. Let's go and do this inside of our code. We'll write .container display flex. And if we go back and refresh, perfect, that's just what we need. Now these two divs, instead of one being on top of each other, they are now side by side. This is because when you add display flex to the parent, then the children of this div with the display of flex will now align next to each other. This is because when you add display flex to the parent, then the children will now line up next to each other rather than stacking on top of each other. And this is exactly what we need. The next thing we want to do is have these icons right next to the text. So again, we can see this clock icon is above the 3 days left content, but we need them to be side by side. So we can do the exact same thing that we just did. Here we have this parent div with the class of time, and we have two child elements. The first child element is this image tag, and the second one is this div with the 3 days left content. We want time and price to both have children divs that are side by side. Back in our CSS, we'll say time, comma, and price, and this just means that we're going to grab both of these selectors, and we want them both to have a display of flex. If we save and then refresh, we can see, perfect, our icons are both now side by side. The next thing we're going to do is add justify content space between. We also can add align items center to center our items. Go back and that looks a little bit better. We also want to add some font weight to this container, so we'll do this now. We'll say font weight 400. And this is just so the children text inside of this container will look a bit more like the design. We also want to give our container a little bit of margin. So we'll say margin 15 pixels and 0. And if you recall, this is going to give a top and bottom margin while leaving the left and right margin at 0. If we go back to our card and we refresh, we can see there is a little bit of margin on the top and bottom here. We can see that we have some space between this icon and this text, and we also have some space between this icon and this text. If we go back to our app, we can see that these are very close together. So let's add a little bit of margin right to both of these images. Let's go in and say .time image, comma, .price image, and then we'll say margin right 5 pixels. And this will add a little bit of margin right to both of these image tags inside of these time and price divs. Let's go back and refresh, and we can see that we've added just a little bit of space right there. We can also see this if we use our inspector and we see there's just the slightest margin. Let's close out of our dev tools for now. Now that we've closed our dev tools, we can see that our card is not centered in the middle of the page. If we look back in our designs and we zoom out, we can see that our card is centered. We'll go back up to our card selector that we have here, and we'll say margin 50 pixels, 50 pixels, and then auto. If you recall, when there are only two values here with the margin property, then it means top, bottom, left, right. 50 pixels is for a bit of margin at the top and the bottom, and then auto here is saying margin right is going to be auto and margin left is going to be auto. You might be wondering, why are we using auto here? When we say margin auto for the left and the right margins of an element, we're saying equal margin is given on either side of that element. And that's how it gets centered in the middle of the page. Let's save this and go back to see how our app looks. Here we can see that there is now equal margin given on both the left and the right, which centers our card to the middle of the page. And now let's go back to our designs and see what else we need to build. A pretty big part of this NFT preview card is the active state. And this is how things look when your mouse is hovering over the card. And so here, when your mouse hovers over the image, you actually see this big blue color, and then you see this eye, and you can kind of still faintly see the NFT image. One thing I'd encourage you to do now is pause the tutorial, go try to build this, and then come back afterwards. I always try to do this when I'm going through a coding tutorial because it helps me jump in there and try to actively learn more than just following along. Let's look at how we might build this. Okay, so if we're looking at this active state, it looks like there is just this blue div with an eye icon in the middle. And it's kind of plastered over our NFT image. And so the first state is just this image. And then when your mouse hovers over the image, you get this blue and you see this eye icon. This might seem like quite a lot to build, especially when you're getting started. So let's just break this down step by step. First, let's just build a blue div. Let's just literally build a blue div, and let's throw an eye icon inside of that div, and then we'll worry about the rest later. We're going to go right beneath our image. and we are going to create this div. Then we're going to give it a class of image overlay. Now, an image overlay is kind of the name for something that goes over an image, and that's why we're giving it this class name. Then we're going to create a little space right here, and we're going to go grab the eye icon from our starter files. We're going to add it back to our images folder and go from there. Back over here, we're going to copy our icon view, hit copy, and then again, we're going to paste this into our images folder. Okay, so now let's create an image element with that eye icon. So we'll say image src. Again, we have this nice autocomplete and we want to click on icon view. Again, we can create an alt, eye icon, and then we will close this image element. Here we can hit save. Now if we go back and refresh, we see that we have just created this div with the eye icon. Next, let's do the next simplest step possible. Let's go back to our image overlay div, so this div, and let's give it the background color that we want. We'll head back to our styles. We'll just scroll down at the bottom here. We'll say image overlay, and then we'll say background color. And we can see that it was this light cyan color. There we go, cyan. And then we'll hit save. If we go back to our app and refresh one more time, we see, yay, it has the right color. If we go back to our code, we can see that this image overlay div is right underneath our image element that has the NFT card image. If we go back to our app, we can see that this makes sense, right? Because this image div is on top, and then next written underneath it is this other image overlay div. But the thing is, we don't want this light blue div to be underneath the image. We want it to be on top of that image. So how can we do that? We can do this by using CSS Positions. The position property specifies the type of positioning method used for an element. If we open up our DevTools again, and we go and inspect this, we could write out different CSS positions. And we can do this by saying the property name of position, and we can see all sorts of values that we have in here. We have absolute, fixed, inherent, and so on. Now, all HTML elements are positioned static by default. And position static does not position elements in any special way. It just positions elements according to the natural flow of the page. So every single HTML element we have on this page just has a regular old position static as its default CSS. But in our case, we want to use position absolute. We want to take our image overlay icon and we want to make it an absolutely positioned div. Now, once you learn about how position absolute works, you'll use it for many different projects. Although it's okay if you don't understand it entirely right now, because I think CSS positions can be really confusing at first. Let's go over what position absolute does and why would we even use it here. For position absolute, it's going to do two things. First, the element is removed from the normal document flow and no space is created for the element in the page layout. Right here with this regular positioned static element, we've created space, right? But when we write out position absolute, this element will no longer have any space. It's almost like the page ignores it. The second thing that using position absolute allows us to do is that it gives us access to these different properties called top, bottom, and we'll get more into those in a little bit. But first, let's go ahead and write position absolute. So here with position absolute, we're saying, okay, remove this element from the normal flow of the page and kind of pretend this element isn't here. And now it appears that this element is stacked on top of something else because it's almost invisible to the page now. And this is exactly what we want. Let's go back to the code and add that position absolute to our image overlay. So position absolute. We didn't need to add position absolute here in our DevTools, but sometimes I like to play around in DevTools and add CSS here so that I know it works before I go and add it to the code. So let's remove that and then refresh, and we can see that this is still positioned absolutely just as we want it. Now the page is basically ignoring this div with the class of image overlay, and it's creating no space for it. And again, this is exactly what we want because we want this div to appear as if it's on top of this image. Now we're getting much closer to what we want. As I said earlier, position absolute allows us to use other CSS properties like top, bottom, left, and right. If we want to add bottom 0, let's see what happens. Bottom 0. Now that we've added bottom 0, we can see that we're moving around this div, and it's gone to the bottom of the page now. In other words, we've now set bottom 0, and this is saying, okay, this div is now 0 away from the bottom of the page. If we said bottom 20 pixels, then it would be 20 pixels away from the bottom of the page. This absolutely positioned div is going to look for an ancestor that has a position on it. Now, this div is absolutely positioned, but it has no parent that is a positioned element. And we can tell because if we look at its parents, none of its parents have a position property on them. And so because this absolutely positioned item doesn't have any parent that is a positioned element, then it's just going to use the document body and it's going to move around relative to the document body. But we don't want our eye icon to be positioned relative to the document body. We want it positioned relative to its parent card. So the next thing we're going to do is give a position relative to our div with the card class. We'll come back in here, we'll go back to the card and we'll say position relative. Oops. Position relative, and we'll hit save. And this automatically formats this for me. Now we've come back to our app and we've hit refresh. Now if we add bottom 0, this absolutely positioned element will now position itself relative to the card. And this is because this card now has a position of relative. So we have this parent card and the parent has this position of relative. And then we have this child div, image overlay here, and it has the position absolute. And if this is still a bit confusing, essentially what we've done here is we've said this child div with the position absolute will position itself in relation to its positioned parent, which is now this card div. And this card div is the positioned parent because we gave it a position of relative. CSS positions definitely took me a bit of time to learn. I think that can be really confusing at first. So you might need to look through here and play around in some examples. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to give a height and width to this image overlay div. Back in our CSS styles, we're going to scroll down and we're going to give a height of 400 and a width of 400. And we want to do this so this image overlay blue div has the same height and width of the NFT image. If we go back and refresh, we can see that this is now the same height. And now, since we have our parent div with the position relative and our child div with the position absolute, we can use our top and left CSS properties. First, we'll say top 25 pixels. Then we can say left 25, which is 25 pixels away from the left of the card. And then back here, we can see that this is exactly where we want it to be. We can also give it a border radius because we can see this is looking like quite a square, but in our designs, the border is a little bit curved. We'll go back here and we'll say border radius 2%. Now we have our image overlay exactly how we want it. But we only want this blue div to be showing when a user hovers over the NFT image. Right now, it's showing at all times whether or not my mouse is going over here or not. Let's fix this. First, let's add opacity 0 to our image overlay. Now, this will actually hide this entire div. If we go back here and refresh, it seems to be gone. Next, let's use the hover property. So we'll say image overlay, hover. And now, similar to what we did earlier, we're saying, okay, whenever a user hovers their mouse over this image overlay, then the styles inside of here will get applied. And what do we want to happen when we hover over this div? Well, when we hover over this div, we want it to appear. And so we can add opacity 0.6. Now we can go back and hit refresh. And now we see our NFT image and If we hover, there is our blue icon. What we've done is we've said we have this blue div, but we are actually hiding it, although it is still there. And then we are saying that when you hover over it, we want it to appear again. We can also give this a transition. So we can use the transition property and we can say transition of 1 second. And this means that the opacity, when it goes from 0 to 0.6, or in other words, when it goes from not showing to showing, it will take 1 second to do so. Oh, and I can see here that we actually forgot our S, so we'll write 1S. If we go back and refresh and we hover, you can see that this div comes in slowly. Awesome, so this is looking good. We are so close to being finished with this NFT preview card. The next thing we want to do is position this eye icon in the center of this image overlay div. Back in our image overlay, we can add display flex, justify content center, and then lastly, we can add align items center. And this is all going to get our eye icon exactly where we want it to be. So if we refresh, we can now see that it'll be right in the middle there. Back in our designs, we can see that this price right here is actually in this light blue. Let's go and add that. Now back over here, we can say price, and then we're going to use the selector of first child. Now first child means go inside of this price div and apply these styles to the first child div within it. So we can say color var cyan, and then we're going to hit save. Now if we go back to our app and then we hit refresh, we can see that this changed to the color we want it to. Back in our starter files, we can see we still need to add this image with the creator's name. Let's go ahead and copy this image avatar. We'll go back to our app and we'll paste it in like so. We'll go ahead and close this now. And then we'll come back to our index.html. Now we'll go outside of this container and we'll create another div. We'll use the class name of creator here. Next, let's go back to our starter files and grab the creator's name. We can go back to our index.html file in our starter files, and we're just going to copy this. So we'll create a div, and then we'll paste in creation of, and then we'll also have our image. So we'll say image src, images, and then we want image avatar, and we'll close that up. We'll also give this an alt of creator. Now let's save this and go see how it looks. If we come back over here and refresh, we can see that we have our image and we have the text we need, although we still need to style it. So again, this image tag is on top of this div, and as we learned earlier, we can use display flex to line up these divs. So let's do that. We know that if we add display flex to this creator class, then its two children will stop stacking on top of each other and they'll line up side by side. So let's just do that. Let's go back down here. We'll say creator display flex. And just like earlier, if we refresh, now they're right next to each other. Perfect. We also want to center this text. So we'll add align items center. If we refresh and go back, we can see that this is lined up perfectly. Next, we're going to go and work on this image more. We'll say .creator image width of 50 pixels, and then we'll give it a margin right of 20. If we refresh again, we can see that this is looking much better. We have the margin there, we have the text centered, and we have the image much smaller, and that's how we want it from looking at our design. If we go back and look at our design, we can see that this image has a border around it. And there's also some differences over here with the text being different colors. Let's go back to working on that. Now let's say border 2 pixels solid, and then we'll use the CSS variable of white. Save that. Go back and refresh, and we can see that this is a border, but it is square. And so to fix this, we can say border radius 100%, and save, go back. Perfect, that's looking great. If we go back to our designs again, we can see that this creation of is in the soft blue text, but the creator's name, Jules, is actually in white. And if we look over at the active state, we can see that when you hover over the name, it turns into this blue color. Now, what we need to do if we go back here is we need a way of just selecting this name. We could make a class here, and then we could add styles such as color blue, but that would make all of this blue, and we don't want this entire bit of text blue. We only want this to have style differences. So how do we do this? So we could actually wrap this in a div. So we could say div, go copy this, and then paste it here. And now we could add styles just to this div. We could give it a class name, and that could work. When we come back to our card and we refresh the page, we see something really interesting happening. Creation of and the creator's name Jules are now on two different lines, and that is actually not what we want. We want them side by side. Let's go over another fundamental concept in CSS. Block elements versus inline elements. Every HTML element has a default display value depending on what type of element it is. And there are two display values, block and inline. There are a few key differences between block elements and inline elements. One of the differences that we'll be talking about right now is a block element always starts on a new line, whereas an inline element will not start on a new line. A div is a block level element. And the reason this is important to learn right now is because we put this creator's name inside of a div. And a div is a block level element. A block level element will always start on a new line, whereas an inline element will not start on a new line. And so instead of using a div here, we'll use an inline element. Let's make this switch. We'll say span, and we'll go into the closing tag and we'll say span. We'll save this. Let's go back to our app and refresh. And perfect. We can see we still have an element wrapping around the creator's name of Jules, but now we have an inline element, and this element will stay on the same line, which is exactly what we want. Now back in our code, we can go to our styles. We can scroll down and we can say creator span. So we're selecting for that span tag as our selector, and we can say color var white. Back again to refresh, and perfect. Just this span alone has this color of white. Next, we want to have that beautiful light blue cyan color when you hover over the creator's name. So we'll say creator span hover, and then on hover, we'll have this beautiful color. So we'll say var cyan. We'll save this. Again, back in our app, we will refresh, and when you hover, we can get this beautiful blue. Let's go back to our designs and see what's left for our NFT card. We are so close to almost being done. Now back in our card, we can see that there's actually this faint, very, very faint line that's right above the creator div. We can add this line by going back to our div, and we're actually going to go ahead and add a border bottom. So this will give a border, but just to the bottom of this container. So we'll say border bottom, 1 pixel solid, and we'll use the line variable. Now you might have forgotten about this, but we added this variable in much earlier at the beginning of the course. Let's save this and refresh. Our container div now has this border bottom, but it looks a little bit squished. So let's add some padding bottom. We'll say padding bottom 20 pixels. At our app again, we'll refresh and we'll see that there's some nice space right here. Okay, we've now built our NFT preview card. In this course, we learned HTML and CSS fundamentals. You can use these fundamentals throughout your career as a developer. We learned about HTML syntax, HTML elements. We learned about the difference between block elements and inline elements. And we learned how to add CSS to your HTML elements. We learned about CSS syntax, CSS basics, and we went over many foundational concepts in CSS, such as the box model and CSS positions. Thanks so much for watching.